Welcome to the lecture entitled Sexual Anticipation and Sexual Satisfaction. I'm Andrew Chapman. In this lecture, we'll discuss 8 topics. 1. Moulton's thesis and philosophical methodology. 2. Necessary and sufficient conditions and explication. 3. Nagel's thesis and Moulton contra Nagel. 4. Salmon's thesis and argument and Moulton contra Salmon. 5. The communication model of sexual behavior. 6. The anticipatory analysis of sexual behavior. 7. The value of novel sexual encounters. And 8. A feminist reading of Moulton's article. In this lecture, we'll be focusing primarily on Janice Moulton's 1976 article, Sexual Behavior, Another Position. Moulton is a research associate in the Department of Philosophy at Smith College. Her research focuses on a number of areas, including, but not limited to, the philosophy of education, the philosophy of sex, feminist philosophy, and philosophical methodology. According to Moulton, prominent accounts of the nature of or essence of sex, especially those accounts given by Thomas Nagel and Robert Solomon, focus only on one aspect of sexual behavior, or on one sort of sexual behavior, namely anticipatory behavior. However, such an anticipation-centered account of sexual behavior leaves out an important additional and maybe even separate component of sexual behavior: sexual satisfaction or enjoyment. Further, though, it is not clear even when sexual satisfaction is added to the analysis of sexual behavior that any particular account can capture the necessary and sufficient features of sexual behavior. Moulton is responding to Nagel and Solomon in order to highlight an aspect of sexual behavior that is important to understand when attempting to understand all of sexual behavior. Both Nagel and Solomon seem to assume that sexual behavior is characterized by the phenomenon of anticipation, and, as such, they conclude implicitly or explicitly that certain types of sexual behaviors, for example, those that typify long-term committed relationships, are inferior to behaviors that are mostly or even entirely anticipatory in nature. Moulton's assumption, on the other hand, is that these sexual behaviors, namely those that typify long-term committed relationships, are not inferior to behaviors that are mostly or even entirely anticipatory in nature. But if Moulton's assumption is correct, then Nagel's and Solomon's analyses of sexual behavior are either not complete or are not correct, or both. An account of the satisfaction or enjoyment-based component of sexual behavior is needed. In essence, Moulton is seeing whether Nagel and Solomon have correctly identified the individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for something to count as sexual behavior. If not, then more work needs to be done in analyzing the nature or essence of sexual behavior. A condition is a test that something has to pass. So to meet a condition is simply to pass a test. A necessary condition is a condition that a particular thing has to meet in order to be what it is. Thus, if X is a necessary condition for A, then anything that is an A meets condition X, and nothing that does not meet condition X is an A. So for example, being warm-blooded is a necessary condition for being a mammal. All mammals are warm-blooded, and no things that are not warm-blooded are mammals. A sufficient condition is a condition such that anything that meets that condition is some particular thing. Thus, if Y is a sufficient condition for B, then anything that meets condition Y is a B, and nothing that is not a B meets condition Y. Example, being a square is a sufficient condition for being a rhombus. All squares are rhombuses, and nothing that is not a rhombus is a square. It can help to think of necessity and sufficiency relations as relations of inclusion. So just remember the following diagram. Being inside the smaller of the two circles is sufficient for being inside the larger circle. All things that are in the smaller circle are in the larger circle. And being inside the larger circle is necessary for being inside the smaller circle. Something can't be inside the smaller circle without being inside the larger circle. The concepts of necessity and sufficiency aren't mere academic curiosities. If you confuse necessity with sufficiency, you're prone to make all sorts of mistakes. For example, while cowards might refuse to fight in some situation, so being a coward is sufficient for not fighting, this doesn't mean that all people who don't fight in that situation are cowards. Being a coward isn't necessary for not fighting. Oftentimes, when we're searching for an explication of something, we're searching to make some thing's essence or nature explicit. What we'll be looking for is a set of a few conditions that are individually necessary and jointly sufficient for that thing. This phrase, individually necessary and jointly sufficient, is something that philosophers often use when talking about the definition or nature or essence of something. Imagine that you're starting a bonfire. You get together some paper, small branches for kindling, larger logs for burning, and then you use a match to light the paper. If you were missing just one of these elements, paper, branches, logs, match, not to mention the oxygen and a few other things, your bonfire couldn't have resulted. Each of these elements was individually necessary for your bonfire. And once you got all of these elements together, you had yourself a bonfire. The entire set of elements was jointly sufficient for your bonfire. Thus, when we're searching for a set of conditions for something to count as sexual behavior, we'll often be searching for conditions that are individually necessary anything missing even one of these conditions couldn't be sex, and jointly sufficient. Anything that has all of these conditions is sex for something to count as sexual behavior. According to Thomas Nagel, sexual behavior is typified by the phenomenology of mutual recognition, that is, by levels of awareness of attraction and desire and arousal on the part of the subject, levels that also include an awareness of attraction and desire and arousal on the part of the object of sexual desire. Thus, Nagel's entire picture of the nature of sexual behavior is one that focuses strictly on the feelings of sexual awareness, attraction, and desire, and not at all on sex itself or on the more stable relationships that might sometimes surround sex. It's important to note that while the emphasis of Nagel's article, in which he presents this analysis of sexual behavior, is on sexual perversion rather than the nature of sexual behavior, since Nagel defines sexual perversion as a form of deviation from ideal sexual behavior, we can extract a definition of sexual behavior from Nagel's article, from his picture of what perversion is a deviation from. However, Moulton thinks that Nagel has gotten something fundamentally wrong, or at least fundamentally incomplete, about the nature of sexual behavior. Says Moulton, granted that levels of mutual awareness exist in any close human relationship, but it does not follow that the development of levels of awareness characterize all human relationships, particularly sexual relationships between familiar partners. Further, she says, Nagel's contribution lies in directing our attention to the analysis of sexual behavior in terms of its perceptions and feelings. However, Nagel characterizes only a limited sort of sexual behavior, namely flirtation and seduction. And finally, says Moulton, if we accept Nagel's account for sexual behavior in general, then we must classify as a perversion the behavior of an intimate and satisfying sexual relation begun without any preliminary exchange of multi-level arousals. Thus, the point of what Moulton is saying here is that, yes, Nagel might tell us something about some of the things that characterize some sexual interactions, but he hasn't managed to put his finger on all of the essence or nature of what constitutes sexual behavior. At best, he's told us about feelings and perceptions that characterize flirtation and seduction, but this is not all of sexual behavior. Robert Solomon employs a model of interpersonal communication, or intercourse, we might say, to seize this rare double entendre opportunity, for his analysis of sexual behavior. According to Solomon, a form of physical or body language is the main vehicle of communication in sexual behavior. What is communicated via this body language is feelings and desires. Thus, sexual behavior is goal-oriented, although these goals needn't be satisfied. The essence of the behavior is its goal-directedness. This communicational model of sexual behavior leads Solomon to conclude that novel sexual encounters are superior to familiar sexual encounters, since in the former, in novel sexual encounters, there's more to say, since less is yet known, and in the latter, familiar sexual encounters, there is less to say, since more is already known, and hence the sexual conversation is predictable and routine in familiar sexual encounters. Each partner already knows the other's feelings and desires. In order to arrive at his conclusion that sexual behavior is, in essence, a form of communication and not a form of enjoyment or something else, Solomon relies on an argument that combines empirical data with philosophical analysis of that data. Solomon's argument, when reconstructed, looks like this. Premise 1. Empirical studies have shown that orgasm is, in general, less intense in interpersonal sexual activity than it is in masturbation. Premise 2. People, in general, express a preference for interpersonal sexual activity over masturbation. Premise 3. If people in general prefer interpersonal sexual activity to masturbation, even though orgasm is more intense in the latter than in the former, then it is communication rather than enjoyment that is the essence of sexual behavior, and therefore, our conclusion, it's communication rather than enjoyment that is the essence of sexual behavior. Premises 1 and 2 here rely on empirical data, studies that have been done of people's sexual preferences. Premise 3 is some philosophical analysis of that data that would lead us to 4, our conclusion. However, Moulton not only doesn't buy Solomon's conclusion, she doesn't buy the reasoning that leads up to it. First, Contra Solomon's central argument, Moulton says, one obvious answer is that even for people who have hassles and arguments, interpersonal sexual activity is more enjoyable even in the pure physical sense. Solomon's argument does not show that enjoyment is not the appropriate aim of sexual activity, only that maximum intensity orgasm is not. As those recent physiological studies pointed out, participants report interpersonal sexual activity as more enjoyable and satisfying even though their orgasms are less intense. Only someone who mistakenly equated enjoyment with orgasm would find this paradoxical. And second, contra Solomon's analysis of sexual behavior, Moulton says, Solomon argues that the aim of sexual behavior is to communicate one's attitudes and feelings, to express oneself, and further, that such self-expression is made less effective by aiming at enjoyment. Does stress on enjoyment hinder self-expression? Trying to do one thing, X, may interfere with trying to do another, Y, for some X's and Y's. For example, trying to eat peanut butter or swim underwater may interfere with vocal self-expression. But enjoyment is a different sort of goal. Far from interfering, one is more likely to be successful at a venture if one can manage to enjoy oneself during the process. According to Moulton, the main problem with Solomon's communication model of sexual behavior is not the model itself, but instead with Solomon's impoverished understanding of how language works. Language use, says Moulton, isn't just about communication, and neither is sex. Says Moulton, language is often used to produce a shared experience, a feeling of togetherness or unity. Duets, greetings, and many religious services use language with little information content to establish or reaffirm a relation among the participants. Long-term sexual relationships, like regular musical ensembles, may be valued more for the feelings produced than the feelings communicated. With both sexual and linguistic behavior, an interaction with a stranger might be an enjoyable novelty, but the pleasure of linguistic and sexual activity with good friends are probably much more frequent and more reliable. Thus, the point Moulton is making here is that it's not as though Solomon is wrong that sexual behavior, sexual activity functions like language does. It's just that Solomon appears not to recognize that language does more than just communicate. So we can use Solomon's language-based, communication-based model in making sense of what sexual behavior is necessarily, if we see that not only does sex communicate sometimes, but it also serves to reinforce and to reaffirm relationships among the participants. Even though Nagel is providing a phenomenological account of sexual behavior and Solomon is providing a communication-based account, both, according to Moulton, are providing analyses of sexual behavior in terms of anticipation of sex. However, once we recognize that excitement and enjoyment are not the same thing as either anticipation or intensity of orgasm, and further that there is a legitimate component of sexual behavior that involves enjoyment and satisfaction, we can see that an anticipatory analysis of sex is incomplete. According to Moulton, it may be that the anticipation itself is all that's valued in sexual behavior for some people, and so the satisfaction component of sex is ignored in that it's not considered sexually valuable. However, for other people, maybe even for most people, experiences can be satisfying and enjoyable even if there's no anticipation at all. And further, experiences with a lot of anticipation can end up being unsatisfying precisely because of that anticipation. Comfort, trust, and even familiarity can increase satisfaction, but can decrease both uncertainty and other challenges that are involved with the mere anticipation of sex. For both Nagel and Solomon, there's nothing inferior about novel sexual encounters, and in fact, for Solomon, novel sexual encounters are the best possible sexual encounters because there's more to be learned, because there's more to be communicated. However, this conclusion is supported by the anticipatory analysis of sexual behavior alone, an analysis with which Moulton has shown there are serious problems. Says Moulton, the usual conversation of strangers is small talk, cautious, shallow, and predictable because there has not been time for the participants to assess the extent and nature of common interests they share. So too with sexual behavior. First sexual encounters may be charged with novelty and anticipation, but are usually characterized by stereotypic physical interactions. if the physical interaction is seen as body language, the analogy with linguistic behavior suggests that first encounters are likely to consist of sexual small talk. Moulton does not take herself to have shown that sexual anticipation is not an important component of sexual behavior for some people. Neither does she take herself to have shown that sexual enjoyment and satisfaction are superior to or valued more than sexual anticipation for all people. What Moulton has shown is that an account of the essence of sexual behavior that relies solely on anticipation will leave out important components of sex, namely those related to sexual enjoyment and satisfaction. But be careful here. Moulton is not saying that sexual behavior is like whatever you want it to be, man. She's saying that while individual preferences might stress one or the other component of sexual behavior, part of the essence of sexual behavior is enjoyment and satisfaction, regardless of what you choose to value. Despite the fact that Moulton herself doesn't explicitly present her article or its thesis as feminist philosophy of sex, there's a reading of the article itself and of the positioning of the article within the philosophy of sex literature that is feminist in nature. One influential strain of feminist philosophy has taken it as important to recognize that the relative lack of women and other traditional minorities within the academy in philosophy can lead to ignored, intentionally or not, possibilities and perspectives, those of women and other minorities within the academy. Moulton is, of course, a woman who is responding to two men. The position of these two men is similar in its traditional masculinity. Anticipation, control, and novelty are central. Moulton's response highlights traditionally feminine aspects of relationships, satisfaction, stability, fulfillment, and shows how an account of sexual behavior that leaves these aspects out is a seriously impoverished account. In this lecture, we've looked at 8 topics. 1. Moulton's thesis and philosophical methodology. 2. Necessary and sufficient conditions and explication. 3. Nagel's thesis and Moulton, Contra Nagel. 4. Solomon's thesis and argument and Moulton, Contra Solomon. 5. The communication model of sexual behavior. 6. The anticipatory analysis of sexual behavior. 7. The value of novel sexual encounters. And 8. A feminist reading of Moulton's article. Thank you.